Statistically speaking, the pioneers of the Old West didn't eat like the cowboys and settlers you see in Hollywood movies. There were no juicy steaks sizzling every night, no endless supplies of coffee, and certainly no fancy desserts. In reality, survival on the frontier meant eating whatever you could carry, hunt, or invent. Quick-draw duels may have made the West dangerous, but hunger was often the deadlier foe. Rattlesnakes, dust storms, and miles of barren prairie left families with no choice but to get creative in their kitchens or their campfires. And while we'd all like to imagine ourselves striding through the Wild West, fearless and tough, the truth is most of us wouldn't have lasted long once dinner time rolled around. Could you really sit down to a plate of roasted skunk or dig into a jelly made from calves' feet? How about coffee brewed from sweet potatoes instead of beans? These were not just experiments. They were lifelines for people trying to make it across one of the harshest landscapes in history. Yes, you probably would have starved in the Wild West. But before we get started on this strange menu of survival, do me a favor. Subscribe to the Sleepy Historian tonight. After that, drop a comment and let us know which of these frontier foods you'd actually dare to try. Trust me, some of them are a lot weirder than you think. Okay, partners, roll up your sleeves. It's time to eat like a pioneer. The Old West was not a land of comfort. Pioneers who traveled across endless plains and rugged mountains rarely had the luxury of choosing what they ate. Food was survival, not pleasure. Every bite had to be earned, and every scrap had to be stretched further than most modern families could imagine. With wagons creaking and oxen straining, settlers carried what supplies they could, but flour, sugar, or coffee often ran out before the journey ended. That's when their creativity took over. They learned to boil bones, grind acorns, and roast animals no one in the city would ever consider edible. Some of their recipes sound unthinkable today, yet to the pioneers, they were lifelines. These meals weren't about taste. They were about living one more day on the frontier. From strange pies made of vinegar to stews that used every organ of a young steer, nothing was wasted. Even the smallest critters hopping through the brush or squirrels clinging to a branch became dinner. In this story, we'll walk through the forgotten menu of survival, 17 dishes that kept early pioneers alive in the unforgiving Wild West. Long before the invention of packaged gelatin, pioneers found their own way to enjoy a wobbly dessert. They turned to calves' feet. By boiling them down, a thick gelatin formed, which settlers then mixed with lemon juice, sugar, and spices. Some even added wine or egg whites, creating something surprisingly refined for the wilderness. It wasn't just a sweet treat, it was practical too. Gelatin helped preserve ingredients and offered calories for weary travelers. One recipe from 1853 explained how to boil 4 calves' feet in a gallon of water until only 2 quarts remained. Strain it, skim the fat, and flavor it with lemon, sugar, and wine. The process was slow and careful, involving repeated filtering through cloth until the jelly was clear. Families sometimes made a savory version as well, closer to the Jewish dish pacha. Though modern folks may cringe at the thought, pioneers saw it as a luxury. After weeks of salted pork and dried beans, even a quivering, slightly odd-tasting jelly felt like a miracle. It was the closest thing they had to dessert on the trail, proving that even in the hardest times, people still craved sweetness. Coffee was one of the most treasured items on the frontier, but supplies vanished fast. When real beans were gone, pioneers improvised. Sweet potatoes became a surprising substitute. Settlers peeled, cooked, and dried the roots, then ground them into a coarse powder. Sometimes they mixed it with a little real coffee if any remained. The result was a drink that looked like coffee, smelled faintly roasted, and gave comfort, even if it lacked caffeine. One 1861 recipe from Georgia suggested slicing the potatoes thin, drying them, and grinding them in a coffee mill. Mixed with 2 tablespoons of actual coffee, the blend made 8 or 9 cups of a warm, earthy brew. Pioneers knew it wasn't the same, but in the morning chill of the prairie, clutching a steaming tin cup was about more than flavor. It was ritual. That bittersweet sip connected them to home, to normal life, and to each other. Around campfires, they drank it with laughter or silence, reminding themselves that comfort, no matter how makeshift, was worth fighting for. Sweet potato coffee may sound strange now, but for pioneers, it was proof that resourcefulness could warm both body and spirit. When food was scarce, pioneers couldn't afford to be picky. That's why even the skunk found its way into frontier cooking pots. These animals, common across North America, provided a modest amount of meat. Of course, there was one very important rule: remove the scent glands before cooking. Without that, the meal was ruined. Once cleaned, skunk could be roasted with vegetables like carrots, creating a dish far more edible than one might expect. A 19th century recipe book even gave instructions for preparing roast skunk, treating it like any other small game animal. Hunters who tasted it said the meat was light and tender, better than raccoon or possum. Still, skunk was a food of necessity, not choice. Families ate it when deer, buffalo, or cattle were out of reach. Sitting around the fire, chewing carefully, they might have joked about it, but no one refused a portion. In the wilderness, turning away meat meant risking starvation. The skunk, often ridiculed for its stench, became another reminder of pioneer determination. Survival required swallowing, pride, and sometimes swallowing things that polite society would never touch. Lemons were rare in the West. Shipping them was expensive, and few settlers could grow citrus successfully. But pioneers still craved the sharp, refreshing tang of lemon pie. Their solution came from the land itself: sheep sorrel, a wild plant, with tart leaves. Women gathered the greens, chopped them finely, and baked them into pies that mimicked lemon flavor. The result wasn't quite lemon meringue, but it was good enough to lift spirits. Sorrel grew abundantly in meadows and fields, costing nothing but effort to collect. To travelers weary of salt pork and hardtack, the pie was a gift from the earth. Sweetened with sugar, spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon if available, it offered a taste of something fresh. Around campfires or inside rough cabins, families sliced into sorrel pie with gratitude. Children might pretend it was the same as real lemon, while adults knew better, but smiled anyway. It was another act of frontier imagination, turning weeds into comfort food. Sorrel pie proved that settlers weren't just fighting hunger, they were fighting for a sense of normalcy, recreating beloved dishes in a land where almost nothing familiar could be found. In the absence of fresh fruit, pioneers leaned on pantry staples to mimic flavors they missed. Vinegar pie became a strange but beloved dessert. Made from flour, vinegar, sugar, and spices, it produced a tangy taste reminiscent of apples or citrus. Settlers poured the mixture into a crust, baked it, and served it warm. At first glance, it sounded odd, but the flavor brought back memories of home. Vinegar was common in wagons, used for cleaning, preserving, and medicine, so it was always available. Turning it into pie was both thrifty and ingenious. Martha Stewart herself has revived the recipe in modern times, showing that this desperation dessert still holds up. In the Old West, it was more than food, it was morale. On long nights in drafty cabins, a slice of vinegar pie reassured families that sweetness could be found even in scarcity. Pioneers may not have had apples or lemons, but they had determination, and that was enough to make a pie worth sharing. The crack of a knife against the crust was a small moment of luxury in a world otherwise ruled by hardship. Cowboys had a saying, "Waste nothing." That belief birthed one of the most famous trail dishes, son-of-a-gun stew, sometimes less politely called son-of-a-bleep stew. It was made from the parts of a calf that couldn't be preserved easily: liver, heart, marrow, sweetbreads, even brains. Everything was chopped up, boiled, and seasoned with salt, pepper, and hot sauce if available. The result was a rich, hearty stew that filled empty stomachs. Cowboys valued it not for its taste, though some swore it was delicious, but for its efficiency. Every organ, every scrap of the animal served a purpose. Around chuck wagons, the stew was ladled into tin bowls and eaten quickly before long rides. The name itself reflected cowboy humor, half crude, half affectionate, but always practical. For pioneers, son-of-a-gun stew was a symbol of survival through ingenuity. What modern diners might discard as inedible became a sustaining meal on the open range. It captured the spirit of the frontier. Tough, resourceful, and unwilling, too. Waste a single thing that could keep a body alive in the unforgiving Wild West. Traditional wheat flour was often scarce on the trail. When supplies ran out, pioneers turned to nature's abundance. Acorns. Native tribes had long used acorns as food, and settlers learned from their example. First, the acorns were roasted or leached to remove their bitter tannins. Then they were ground into a fine meal and mixed with water, salt, or sometimes cornmeal to form dough. Baked in ashes or fried in a pan, the bread was dense but filling. Acorn bread wasn't a delicacy. It was survival. It gave energy for long walks beside wagons or days spent splitting logs. Children grew up on its nutty, earthy flavor, often without ever tasting soft white flour bread until years later. For pioneers, every bite was a reminder that the land could sustain them if they learned its secrets. Turning forest nuts into bread required time and effort, but it provided independence from costly supplies. In cabins and camps across the West, acorn bread was eaten plain or with whatever meat or stew was available. It was tough food for tough people, forged from patience and necessity. When pioneers hunted a bear, it wasn't just for the hide or steaks. They used everything, including the head. From it, they made head cheese, a dish with no actual cheese. The process began by soaking the head meat in brine, then boiling it until tender. The meat was chopped, seasoned, and pressed into a mold where it cooled into a jelly-like loaf. Sometimes aspic, a savory gelatin, was used to hold it together. When sliced, the head cheese could be eaten cold, carried on journeys, or traded. A bear provided so much meat that preserving it all was crucial. Head cheese stretched supplies further, ensuring nothing spoiled. Around pioneer tables, the sight of a quivering slice might not inspire delight, but it was food, and food meant survival. Children learned early not to question, only to chew. For pioneers, head cheese represented their unyielding commitment to making use of every part of the animal. In a world where waste could mean hunger or death, even a bear's head became a feast, one carved from necessity, skill, and the refusal to let anything go unused. Few dishes shock modern readers like Rocky Mountain oysters. The name hides the truth. They are bull-calf testicles, peeled, battered, and fried. On the frontier, ranchers had to castrate calves as part of managing herds. Rather than discard the parts, cowboys tossed them into the pan. The result? A surprisingly tasty delicacy with a crisp outside and tender inside. Cowboys sometimes called it cowboy caviar, laughing as they passed plates around the fire. To them, it wasn't strange. It was just another way to make use of what was available. Testicles provided protein and calories, and once fried, their flavor resembled mild meat rather than anything shocking. In time, the dish became a symbol of cowboy culture, still served at festivals and Western bars today. Back then, it was simply survival with a side of humor. Eating Rocky Mountain oysters showed the gritty practicality of frontier life. No part of the animal went to waste, and every meal was earned, even if it required a strong stomach and a willingness to chew something most would never dare to try. Not every frontier recipe was about flavor. Some were about health, or at least what pioneers thought would restore it. Beef tea was one such concoction. Made by boiling thin strips of salted beef in water, then straining, it produced a warm broth. Doctors and mothers alike gave it to the weak, the sick, and the weary. It was said to stimulate appetite and restore strength. Sometimes lamb or chicken was used instead, but beef was preferred. The tea wasn't filling, yet it carried nutrients that travelers desperately needed. On nights when children were pale, or elders too frail to chew, a cup of beef tea was placed in their hands. In cabins where illness swept through, its steam carried hope. Today, it might seem like nothing more than broth, but in the Old West, it was medicine as much as food. It showed how pioneers blurred the line between eating and healing, using whatever they had to keep their families alive. Beef tea was survival, served in a tin cup, warming both the body and the spirit against the cold frontier night. Jackrabbits hopped across the prairies in abundance, and pioneers quickly turned them into food. The meat was lean, easy to roast, and readily available. Families welcomed the quick protein, especially when larger game was scarce. But eating rabbit alone came with a hidden danger, what we now call rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. Too much lean meat without fat or other nutrients caused settlers to grow weak, even as they ate. Some described the feeling as endless hunger, no matter how much rabbit was consumed. Still, pioneers often relied on jackrabbit when nothing else could be found. Children learned to snare them, while adults hunted with rifles or traps. A roasted rabbit shared among family members might not satisfy fully, but it kept bodies moving. In time, settlers learned to mix rabbit with fattier foods or stews to avoid sickness, but in desperate moments they ate it anyway, accepting the risk. Jackrabbit meat reflected the paradox of frontier life. Food could save you, or slowly starve you, depending on how it was eaten. Survival demanded knowledge as well as courage. When deer and buffalo were scarce, pioneers turned to smaller prey. Squirrels, plentiful in many regions, became a regular meal. Hunters knocked them from trees by clipping bark beneath their paws, then shot them carefully to avoid wasting precious meat. Though tiny, squirrels added up. Families stewed them or fried them, savoring every bite. For children growing up in log cabins, squirrel stew was a common memory. It wasn't glamorous, but it filled the pot. On the trail, settlers praised squirrels for being easy to catch and cook quickly over a fire. Their lean meat tasted mild, something between chicken and rabbit. Eating squirrels reminded pioneers that nothing in the wilderness should be overlooked. When survival was on the line, even the smallest creatures became valuable. Around flickering campfires, families passed bowls of squirrel stew, reminding themselves that ingenuity turned scarcity into supper. The Old West was full of harsh lessons, and one of the simplest was this: if it had meat on its bones, it was worth catching, cooking, and eating. Sometimes pioneers wanted more than survival. They wanted convenience. Frizzled beef filled that role. Made from dried beef cooked with milk, butter, and flour, it was served over toast for a hearty snack or meal. Easy to make and transport, it became popular on the trail and later in military mess halls, where it earned the nickname SOS, or stuff on a shingle. Frizzled beef stood out because it used preserved ingredients that traveled well. The only fresh part needed was milk, making it far more reliable than fresh meat. Cowboys ate it in the mornings before long rides or in the evenings after exhausting days. The dish was salty, filling, and familiar, qualities that made it beloved despite its plainness. Some modern recipes add onions or peas, but on the frontier, simplicity ruled. Settlers appreciated anything quick that kept them strong. Frizzled beef showed that even in hardship, people sought meals that felt routine. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, and in the unpredictable wilderness, dependable food meant survival. Bread was essential, but ovens were rare on the trail, so pioneers made bannock, also called frying pan bread. The recipe was simple: wholemeal flour, salt, baking powder, and water mixed into dough and fried in a pan over fire. The result was dense, hearty bread that kept stomachs full for hours. Bannock was endlessly adaptable. Some families added dried berries, while others mixed in bits of fat or meat for flavor. Eaten plain or with stew, it became the daily staple of countless settlers. Children often learned to make it as their first cooking task, kneading dough, while mothers tended fires. Around campfires, the smell of frying bread brought comfort. It reminded settlers of home, even if the texture was tougher and heavier than bakery loaves back east. Bannock was survival bread, rugged, practical, and reliable. Its simplicity captured the essence of pioneer cooking: minimal ingredients, maximum necessity. Every bite tasted like endurance, a reminder that even without luxuries, families could break bread together on the harsh and lonely frontier. Fresh meat spoiled quickly on the trail, so preservation was key. Jerky became the solution, and buffalo provided the perfect source. Strips of meat were salted, sometimes smoked, and dried in the sun or near fire. The result was tough but long-lasting. Protein that could be chewed on rides or boiled into stews. Buffalo jerky fueled countless journeys across the plains. Native tribes had perfected the method long before, and pioneers learned from their skill. A bag of jerky in the wagon meant security, meat that wouldn't rot no matter the weather. Families carried it across deserts and mountains, gnawing on strips during hard days. Though chewy and sometimes bitter, it gave strength. In hunting camps, men would slice buffalo into long ribbons and hang them from poles, the smell of drying meat filling the air. Jerky wasn't glamorous, but it kept people alive. On lonely trails, when hunting failed and supplies ran low, buffalo jerky was a silent companion, a reminder that preparation and preservation could mean the difference between making it west or never arriving at all. Not all pioneer meals were memorable for their taste. Some were remembered only for their desperation. Lard cakes made from flour and animal fat were heavy, greasy, and far from delicious, but they provided dense calories that kept hunger at bay. Children might wrinkle their noses, yet they ate them gladly when nothing else remained. Alongside such meals was bone broth, made by simmering animal bones for hours until every last bit of marrow and mineral seeped into the water. It was simple, warm, and sustaining, especially in harsh winters. These foods carried no glamour, yet they were the bedrock of survival. They showed how pioneers refused to waste anything, turning even scraps into sustenance. Around fire-lit cabins, mothers stirred pots of broth while fathers cut lard into dough. Families shared the results with gratitude, knowing it meant one more day alive. In the Old West, meals were not judged by taste, but by endurance. Lard cakes and bone broth might sound unappealing today, but for the pioneers, they were proof of resilience, the will to survive when the land offered little mercy.